In Luke chapter 5, you'll be turning over there. And before we get started this morning, Matt, I'm going to ask you to lead us in a word of prayer. Amen. All right. We are working through, look at there, I put the outline up there first thing. Now I don't have to remember it anymore. All right, so we are in the section there on letter B, his manifestation of power, working through chapter 5. And if you have your lesson sheet from last week, we are looking at the last question on the lesson sheet, and then we'll get into this week's lesson sheet. But beginning in verse 33, it says, "Then they said to him, 'Why do the disciples of John fast often and make prayers, and likewise those of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink?' And he said to them, 'Can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them. Then they will fast in those days.' Then he spoke a parable to them. 'No one puts a piece of new garment on an old one, otherwise the new makes a tear, and also the piece that was taken out of the new does not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, or else the new wine will burst the wineskins and be spilled, and the wineskins will be ruined. But new wine must be put into new wineskins, and both are preserved. And no one, having drunk old wine, immediately desires new, for he says the old is better.'" All right, number 5 on that question sheet, where did the people get the idea to fast? All right, well, yeah, the disciples of John did, but where did they get the idea to fast? From the old law, all right? I tend to think probably it was earlier than that. But you think about it like this. Why would anybody come up with the idea to fast? Because we get hungry, and we want to eat. And why would you go against that? Because God has made us in such a way that we want to have that food. And so you think about fasting, you think about, okay, where did that originate? It had to originate with God in some way. What was you going to say, Francis? It does, yes. Fasting, yeah. Fasting is very good in a physical way. It does help the body. It clears the mind and different things like that. But the idea that man would have ever come up with it on their own, that seems odd to me, to think that would happen. But we do have in the old law, in the law of Moses, there is the idea of fasting, but they fasted a whole lot more than what the law required. I mean, they had gotten into a habit of doing it on a very regular basis. And many of them, my understanding is they would fast twice a week. Here they are asking now, why don't your disciples fast? Why don't, John's disciples fast, and here you are coming in behind John. Why aren't your disciples fasting? What is Jesus' teaching regarding this? When we look at, of course, he talks about the bridegroom and all of that, but then he goes into talking about the old garment and the new garment, old wineskins and new wineskins. What is he trying to teach in all of that? All right, probably talking about the new covenant, absolutely. When he's talking about the bridegroom, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about, look, this is a new thing. Jesus was the bridegroom, and he's talking about, while the bridegroom's there, you don't fast, and so he's talking about whenever he departs, then they'll fast. They'll fast. But then on the flip side of that, he talks about this old garment and the old wineskins and such. And he's talking about the covenants. He's talking about the fact that this old law that all of you are supporting and with your traditions and all of those things, that's going to be going away. And what I'm doing is establishing the new, and they're not compatible. They don't work together. And so he uses those illustrations about the cloth and the wineskins. What about verse 39? What about verse 39? It says, "And no one having drunk old wine immediately desires new, for he says, the old is better." Now yours might say the old is good. All right, good or better is fine. It doesn't matter. The same idea is there. What's he trying to get across? Change is hard. I think that's part of it. Change is hard. I mean, you look how hard it was for the Jews to give up their traditions. Even those that became Christians, later on were trying to bring their Jewish traditions and make that required for the Gentiles. It was hard for them to give that up. Why? They grew up with it. Yeah, they're used to it. Whenever he says they're having drunk the old immediately desires the new, no one having drunk the old immediately desires the new. He's talking about the idea we're fine with what we've got. We don't. I guess it's like this: if you don't ever taste the what's better, then you don't know what you're missing, and you're just okay. There have been times in my life where I have, used tools sometimes until they're just plumb wore out, and then whenever you finally have to go buy a new tool, it's like, why did I wait this long? Why did I wait this long? I just recently replaced the heads on my razor. And listen, I don't do that very often, all right? And I probably, they say like 6 months you're supposed to do it. Well, I translate that to years or whatever. But, yeah. But then you get them new heads, it's like, why did I wait? Why did I put this off? So I think that's what he's talking about here. Do you have any other ideas that might be what he's talking about? I think in the context that's what he's getting at. I didn't read anything different from that in any of the commentaries or that sort of thing. But it's just interesting to look at that. All right, we're going to go into chapter 6. And if you've got your lesson sheet from this morning, that's what we'll be working with. Still in point B here, his manifestation of power. We're going to take that through verse 11 of chapter 6. It says, "Now it happened on the second Sabbath, after the first, that he went through the grain fields. And his disciples plucked the heads of grain and ate them, rubbing their hands together. And some of the Pharisees said to them, Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath? But Jesus answering them said, "Have you not read this, what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he went into the house of God, took and ate the showbread, and also gave some to those with him, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat? And he said to them, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath." All right, what were the disciples accused of doing? Harvesting on the Sabbath, working on the Sabbath. Really what they're saying is, why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And that's what I want you to key in on. They're saying, you are breaking the law. That's what you're doing. Now, were they breaking the law? Technically speaking, they were not. No. There is the rules, but about not doing any work on the Sabbath. Were they harvesting grain? No, they were not harvesting grain. And there is a difference. If you go in and you look at the old law, they were allowed to go through a grain field, someone else's grain field, and they could pluck heads of grain to eat while they're going through the grain field. However, they were not permitted to take a sickle to that grain and actually harvest the grain. And so there's a difference there. But the traditions of the Pharisees didn't allow for that. You see, they had put up some of these roadblocks for them, some of these stumbling blocks for them. But look at the second part of the question. What is Jesus' response? How does he respond to that? Right, he talked about when David was hungry and all of those things. So he's given them an example to help them to better understand. I want you to notice what he did not do. He did not tell them they were wrong. Did you see that? He did not tell them they were wrong. But what he did was he gave them an example to help them understand, yes, the law might say something, but you need to understand the spirit of the law. You need to understand why the law is there. And if man is in need, then the need of man needs to be taken care of. That comes into play in the next few passages that we read as well. All right? You see, they were all about staying with the law, but they did not want to do what was good for man. And so Jesus is trying to help them out with that. I mean, look, David, he was on the run from Saul. And he was in dire need of food. It was an emergency situation. And Jesus says, look, now why did he use David as an example? He was the King of Kings, and the Jews, held him in the highest, absolutely highest regard. And so immediately he's using someone that they hold in high regard and saying, yeah, but, David did this, and what are you going to do with that? But then he says in verse 5, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. Now, what does that mean? He has all authority over it. Some of the other accounts make the idea like this. Man is Lord of the Sabbath, not the Sabbath Lord of man. Now, it doesn't say it exactly that way, but that's kind of the idea that it gives forth. And if someone is hungry, then he needs to do something to have food, even on the Sabbath day. Even on the Sabbath day. Now, the point of, keeping the Sabbath day holy, you're supposed to prepare for that. You're supposed to make preparations so that you don't have to cook anything on that day or work on that day. All right? But what happens if you get in a situation where that doesn't happen? Are you going to go hungry? Well, they did fast, so there you go with it. All right, let's continue on. Beginning in verse 6, it says, Now it happened on another Sabbath also that he entered the synagogue and taught, and a man was there whose right hand was withered. So the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. But he knew their thoughts, and said to the man who had the withered hand, Arise and stand here. And he arose and stood. Then Jesus said to them, I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy? And when he had looked around at them all, he said to the man, Stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. But they were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. All right, number 2, what does this episode show about what the Pharisees were concerned about? The law of the Sabbath. That's what their concern was. I already answered that for you. They were concerned more about the law than the welfare of man. I mean, you think about why Jesus says that. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? What is Jesus doing? What's he pointing out? All right, let's look at this from a different angle. Why did Luke record it the way he did? All right, challenges the law. Yeah. But it's really about the Pharisees' thoughts. That's what he's challenging. Why does he say it like that? Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? They're not going to say evil, are they? They're not going to say evil. He is pointing out the ridiculousness of their thought process. You've got two choices. You either do good or you do evil. Now, which one are you going to do? And that's what Jesus is trying to help. That's what Luke is pointing out when you think about, whose Luke's readers are. Gentiles primarily, probably. But even the Jews reading this, they're going to see that, and they're going to see, they're going to see the ridiculousness of the Pharisees. We saw a lot of that going through the book of Matthew. Matthew was pointing that out really heavily. All right, what lesson did Jesus teach? Because that's what all this is about, is Jesus teaching. So what lesson did he teach? Yeah, it's not just about the law. You can do good on the Sabbath. It is okay to do good. In other accounts, he'll talk about that. He talks about, if you've got a I don't remember how he said it, goat in a ditch or a cow in a ditch, or maybe it was ox in the ditch. I think it was ox in the ditch. If you've got an ox in the ditch on the Sabbath, what are you going to do? You're going to leave him there to die? Or are you going to get him out? You're going to do good on the Sabbath. Here he is healing a man from an infirmity that he has so that he can have a better life. And they're fussing and arguing that he's healing on the Sabbath. Can anybody else do that? No. There is no one else that could have done that. And they're going to pick at Jesus because he can do that he shouldn't do that. Now, there's no law ever written against anything that Jesus did. And that's what he's trying to pull out there. All right, verse 11, but they were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do with Jesus. What are they going to want to do with Jesus? They're going to want to kill him. All right, so we're going to the next section, beginning here in verse 12, is talking about his appointment of helpers. And we're going to just take that through verse 19, so it's a little short section here. I'm just going to go ahead and read 12 through 19, and then we'll talk about those questions. Now it came to pass in those days that when he went out to the mountain to pray, and continued all night in prayer to God. And when it was day, he called his disciples to himself, and from them he chose 12, who he also named apostles. Simon, whom he also named Peter, and Andrew his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who also became a traitor. And he came down with them and stood on a level place with a crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and from the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and be healed of their diseases, as well as those who were tormented with unclean spirits, and they were healed. And the whole multitude sought to touch him, for power went out from him and healed them all. All right, what occurs before Jesus chooses the 12? He prayed all night. Do you think maybe that was an important thing for him to do at that time? Jesus showing us, and Luke is pointing this out, helping us to understand what ought to be involved before major events, before major decisions. We ought to be going to God in prayer. Even the Savior is doing that. These, of course, he says here that these would be named apostles. What does apostles mean? Messenger, sort of. One who's sent. Okay, so the word apostles means one who is sent. And the reason why I take out Jesus is because that word apostle could be applied to other people. But yes, these are apostles, those who are sent by Jesus. All right? And so these 12 are specifically going to be those that will be associated as, like you say, as his messengers. You know, but they're going to be sent from God or from Jesus. All right, number 2, where did Jesus and his disciples go after the 12 were chosen? Verse 17, where did they come down to? A level place. Does anybody else have anything different there? I think the King James Version says a plain. No. Saying that it's a plain is probably going too far. The word that is used there really is just talking about a flat place. That's what it's talking about. And so whenever you think about him coming down from the mountain, he's got his group of disciples coming down with him. And then you've got all of these other people that are gathering around, and here he comes. Maybe he don't even get down off the mountain all the way. You know, this often is called the sermon. Beginning in verse 20 is called the Sermon on the Plain, because basically the King James Version calls it a plain. But I just want you to understand that it might not have been, you know, this great plain that he came down to, but it might just be a little plateau. It might just be, you know, just a level spot that was big enough for himself, you know, to stand on. Probably not. It's probably bigger than that. But here's the thing. Let's wait till we get into that. All right, so he's coming down on a level place. Might be a plain, but probably not. What happened to the crowd? Why did they want to get close to him? To be healed. All right? And what we learn from that is that they were healed. Look at the end of verse 19. For power went out from him and healed them all. I find that phrase interesting, because whenever you think about the idea the whole multitude sought to touch him, it didn't say the whole multitude touched him. It says they sought to touch him. And then it says power went out from him and healed them all. I can't help but wonder if this was one of those instances where they were just all immediately healed by Jesus, even though they might not even be able to get close to him because of the crowd. Did Jesus have the power to do that? Absolutely he did. Absolutely he did. Bottom line is we don't know either way, but it's interesting to think about how that might have transpired there. Okay, so we're getting into this next section, which in way, to me, should be part of the same section, but I'm just going with the outline that was in Tenney's book, and so we'll just stick with that. But the rest of the chapter is talking about his declaration of principles, and it starts with his sermon here in verse 20. And I'm going to read, let's just read verse 20. Then he lifted up his eyes toward his disciples and said, and I'm not even going to read the rest of that verse. All right? To whom is Jesus directing his teaching? His disciples. Okay? Why does that seem different from the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew 5? Do we need to go over and look at it? You want to go over and look at it? Let's go over and look at it. Probably a good idea, ain't it? All right, so in verse 1 of chapter 5 of Matthew, and seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. Then he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, who is he teaching? Disciples. He's teaching disciples. Are other people hearing him? Absolutely. And I think we find that with both sermons. You know, his disciples come to him and sit down around him in order to listen. But there's others who are going to be listening. Now, that multitude, here in Luke, he says that they came from Judea and Jerusalem and Tyre and Sidon. Multitude, great multitude of people. Would we call all of that multitude of people disciples? Not necessarily, but would we call many of them disciples? Right, we would, because they are wanting to learn from Jesus. You know, some of them are just coming to get healed, you know, and we understand that. Of course, Jesus' hope and prayer is that they, even the ones that come to be healed, are going to become disciples. But I would imagine many of them are disciples. Where does this teaching take place? In Luke. And that goes back to our discussion. A level place, a flat place. And really that's the best we know about it. All right? Some have argued that this is the same sermon as the Sermon on the Mount. And as we read through the sermon, you'll see a lot of those similarities, okay? And it is true that possibly he could still be on the mountain, but he's just in a level place. But there are too many things that are different. For one, here in Luke, he's coming down from the mountain. In Matthew, he goes up on the mountain, all right? There are very many similarities in the teaching, and yet there are also many differences. How do we make that work? How do we reconcile that? All right? So, yeah, there's no problem with this being a different sermon, because Jesus is going to be teaching the same things throughout his ministry. You know, those things that he talked about on the Sermon on the Mount, he didn't just teach those one time and just let it go. He's going to continually be teaching these things. And so the idea that this couldn't possibly be another sermon, well, there's no evidence for that. The idea that it could be a different sermon is probable. You know, it probably is. It's a different instance. We have a different time frame that is being talked about. Of course, we know from Matthew, you know, he didn't necessarily put things in chronological order. And so, it could be swapped around a little bit. That's a possibility. But anyhow. All right, so let's read through this sermon, and let's just make a couple of points regarding that. I say through the sermon. I'm going to read through verse 26. We'll work at it that way. Blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you shall be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh. Blessed are you when men hate you, and when they exclude you and revile you and cast out your name as evil for the Son of Man's sake. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for indeed your reward is great in heaven, and in like manner their fathers did to the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full, for you shall hunger. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for so did their fathers to the false prophets. All right, number 2 is one of those questions that whenever I was in school I absolutely hated. Compare and contrast, because that meant I had to do a whole lot more work. That's basically what that comes down to. But let's think about what is the contrast between the Beatitudes from the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes as we have them here. And we would call these Beatitudes, because of the word blessed as we have in the English, the Latin word would be beati. That's where Beatitudes come from, all right? And so these are Beatitudes, but what's different? I mean, we can see the similarities, right? I'm just not going to go back and look at the similarities, but what's different? The word now. Yeah. And he points that out a little bit more here in Luke, doesn't he? The idea that, in verse 21, blessed are you who hunger now. In verse 22, later on in verse 21, blessed are you who weep now. And so the emphasis is, those who are blessed, this is what you're dealing with now. What is the implication? Even if he didn't finish that out, what would be the implication? Better times are coming. There's something better that is going to be had. Of course, he gives us what is better that will be coming. You'll be filled. You shall laugh. What else is different? One of the main things that I notice is there's not near as many of them in Luke's. Matthew's account, there's several down through there. Luke doesn't have that many. But it has a shorter list of the, blessed. Matter of fact, I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4. That's it. I'm counting 4. But what does he include after the Beatitudes? Woes. All right? And so in that list of Beatitudes, the list of blessed statements, then you have down in verses 24 through 26, you have the woes, and those woes are directly contrasting the blessings. All right? And so what he's doing is it helps us to understand what those blessings are all about. If you look in verse 24, woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. What does that mean? Or your comfort you might have. Yeah, all the comfort you get is right here. This is what you're going to get. If you're poor, and we go back to verse 20, blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. And so whenever we see here, at least in this sermon, what is poor talking about? It's talking about poor. Yeah. You go to Matthew's account, and it might be talking about, he says, blessed are the poor in spirit. All right? And I talked about that in a sermon here a week or so ago. It might be talking about the poor, like he's talking about here. It might also be talking about being more humble, and so that one could go either way. But here in Luke, he makes it clear, this is what I'm talking about. This is what I'm getting at here. And then, of course, we go on down through there. Woe to you who are full, for you shall hunger. Woe to you who laugh now. What is he talking about as far as the weeping and laughing? What's he talking about? Yes, mourning sin. That's what he's talking about. In this life, those who live in sin, they're having a good old time. They're enjoying themselves. Sin in this world is enjoyable. Now, there's non-enjoyable parts of sin too, but they don't look at that, And so they're having a good old time now. They're celebrating. They're having a good time. But later on, they're going to weep. On the other hand, those of you who are trying to stick with the Word of God and seeing, sometimes it's a struggle to do that. And it makes us weep. It makes us mourn. Maybe not necessarily because of our own lives, but looking at the world around us and seeing the sin that they're living in. There are so many people in this world that you really want to help. You are so deep in this that you cannot see what it is doing to you. Family members and friends and people I've associated with over the years that have gone by the wayside, and it's like, do you not understand what you're doing? We need to prepare now for what is to come. We need to prepare, weep and mourn over that now so that we can rejoice then. That's what we need to be doing. All right, so here's the question. Is this the same sermon? It's similar. I'm going to say more than likely not. More than likely not. There's just too many differences, and we'll actually see more of that as we go through the rest of the sermon. All right, beginning in verse 27. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who spitefully use you. To him who strikes you on one cheek, offer the other also. And from him who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who asks of you. And from him who takes away your goods, do not ask them back. And just as you want men to do to you, you also do to them likewise. But if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive back, what credit is that to you? For even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much back. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, hoping for nothing in return. And your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High. For he is kind to the unthankful and evil. Therefore be merciful, just as your Father also is merciful. All right, number 3, how is this teaching connected with the previous section? How do we know it's connected? But, all right, exactly. You have that conjunction there that holds them two together. And so understand, as he gets through talking about those woes, as he's talking about those blessings, he's still talking about, he's got that in the back of his mind. Everybody else does too. I think specifically probably he is thinking on verses 22 and 23, where he's talking about those who would hate you and those who would persecute you, and how you need to act toward them. And so that's what he's doing here. How does Jesus use the Father's example to teach about loving enemies? All right, the idea that even my Father maybe not forgives you, but what does he say in verse 36? He's merciful. He's merciful. Are people going to do bad things to us? Yes. Whether they mean to or not, it's going to happen. Are we going to suffer the persecution like they did in the first century? It's unlikely. It's unlikely. But we are going to have people that we don't like to associate with. We're going to have people that we might view maybe not as enemies, but I don't really want to have anything to do with them. You know what I mean? And so we need to learn that even whenever things are done to us like that, we need to be merciful. God's merciful. Look what he says at the end of verse 35. For he is kind and unthankful. For he is kind to, I get it right. For he is kind to the unthankful and evil. He is kind to the unthankful and evil. And it's the idea, I believe it's in Matthew's account where he talks about he sends the rain on the just and the unjust. God is kind to all, even when they are unkind to him. Those who reject him still receive the blessings of this world. And so we need to understand that in our view of how we treat enemies, we need to think about how does God do that? How does God treat his enemies? All right. We know ultimately God will take care of, who his true enemies are, but that's not what Jesus is trying to teach here. Any thoughts before we continue? I really wanted to get to the end. We'll see. Probably not. Verse 37. Judge not, and you shall not be judged. Condemn not, and you shall not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be put into your bosom. With the same measure that you use, it will be measured back to you. And he spoke a parable to them. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into the ditch? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who is perfectly trained will be like his teacher. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not perceive the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, Brother, let me remove the speck that is in your eye, when you yourself do not see the plank that is in your own eye? Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, then you will see clearly to remove the speck that is in your brother's eye. What does judging have to do with loving your enemies? And maybe why did I ask that question? Oh, did we now? I think I wasn't specifically talking about that, but I will bring that up because it is, we just had an election. And we've all got friends that may differ in opinions from what our opinions are. And they can be unkind. They can be unkind. Y'all make sure you're not unkind. Because I've seen some Christians being unkind. But what's the point? That's exactly right. We're supposed to forgive. We can't be judgmental. All right? Now, he's not talking about, whenever he says don't judge, he's talking about that condemnation of judging. You can't just condemn them for what they have done. They have a different mindset, and you don't know what their mindset is. And so we need to be careful about that. As he goes down through this, notice what he says. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into the ditch? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who's perfectly trained will be like his teacher. How did Jesus deal with his enemies? He loved them. And he did everything he could to try and reach them and help them to come to a better understanding. Now, there were those that he condemned, yes. those who would not see it any other way. Yes. Absolutely. He judged according to God's will. But I want you to think about this, and we look at that whenever we look at the Sermon on the Mount. And we get that mind frame in the Sermon on the Mount, and I think that's probably what he's talking about. But the way this sermon flows here in Luke, I think he's looking back at those enemies, and he's really trying to help us to understand, be careful how you deal with your enemies. We need to be careful about that. He says, of course, we see a lot of similar language that was used in the Sermon on the Mount. You know, why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye and do not perceive the plank in your own eye? And what he's trying to do is trying to help you understand, look, you just because you have a differing opinion does not mean your opinion's right. And you need to check yourself before you try and help anybody else. There have been times that I really thought I knew exactly what the Bible taught on a certain matter. And I was very firm on that. And then I'd be approached by someone who had a differing opinion. And you know what that makes me do? It makes me think about it. It makes me look at it from that different side point and think, am I really right? And you know what? There are times when I really was right. But there are also times whenever maybe I wasn't. And maybe I do need to look at that a little bit differently. And so I think that all of those thoughts is what he's putting into this here, trying to help us to understand how to deal with our enemies. And I've just answered your question, what does the parable teach? You can't teach others if you're blinded by your own problems, if you're blinded by your own firmness, I'll say. You know, you're set in your ways, that sort of thing. All right, we have gone way beyond. Any thoughts or questions? I know some of the kids have come back in. Yes? Yeah. Yeah. That's right. That's right. He's talking about how important it is for us to have these Bible study sessions, these classes. And that's why I always try to strive to get your thoughts and your opinion. I know sometimes we kind of rush through things, but I really want to know what your thoughts are. I really want to know, okay, what do you think about this? Because maybe there's something different. As I started teaching Bible class many years ago, I always went to my Bible classes with the idea that I'm just a guide, just pointing us where we're going to study. And then from that point on, we're going to study it. And we're going to study it together and see what it comes about. Now, recently, I go and do a whole lot of study before I come into class because I want to have some of those answers that we might have. But this is about studying what the Word of God says, not about what I think that it says. That's a good point. That's a good point. If we don't have this basis in Scripture, then when we are out in the world, we may be misled by some of that. But also, and something that I have learned when trying to reach people who are out in the community, remember that they don't come from the same point that you come from. We need to remember that there's a whole lot of baggage they're bringing to that thought process. And so we need to remember that, and we don't need to immediately make ourselves an enemy of that person trying to help them. Learn where they're coming from before you try to help them with anything. And make sure that you're grounded. You're where you need to be. All right, we better quit right there.